The Sino-Soviet split was the deterioration of relation and communication between two of the world's largest superpowers, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. But how did two countries that shared a unique, somewhat unseen ideology to most of the world turn against each other, and even almost start a war in the late 60s? In October 1949, Mao Zedong came into power of China. He and his followers declared themselves victorious in the Chinese Revolution, proclaiming the formation of the People's Republic of China. China, with its population at the time being just over 500 million people, replaced the Soviet Union as the world's most populous socialist state. By rights, Soviet Russia and the People's Republic should have been close allies for the duration of the Cold War. Both had many things in common, including large populations, a strong commitment to Marxist socialism, turbulent revolutions, and many difficulties when transitioning into socialism. Not only did these problems exist for the two, they were also completely surrounded and confronted by Western opposition and alliances, these being NATO in Europe and SEATO in the Asia-Pacific. However, with these similarities, their relationship was complex and changed a lot. In the 1960s, the two powers slowly drifted apart, and by 1968, almost reached the brink of a war. The Sino-Soviet split, as it has become known, was a crucial piece of history for development in the Cold War. In 1919, the Communist International, or Comintern based in Moscow, was formed to promote, support, and offer guidance to socialist revolutionaries around the world. The Comintern played a crucial role in formation and helping direct the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. However, strictly following Marxist theory, a majority of the members of the Comintern believed that China was not yet ready for a socialist revolution. Throughout the 1920s, the CCP's organization, ideology, and methodology was strictly influenced and followed by the advice from Moscow's Comintern. However, in the mid-1930s, Mao Zedong gained control of the CCP and began rejecting the instructions and methodology of the Comintern, arguing that China was ready for a socialist revolution driven by the peasantry. Mao's ideology of peasant socialism planted the seeds of division between Chinese communists and the Soviet Union, which kept on growing. In 1949, Mao Zedong seized control of China. At that time, socialist regimes held power across 1/5 of the world and ruled a combined population of almost 800 million people. A friendly and productive relationship between Moscow and Beijing was considered extremely vital for the advancement of world socialism. Late 1949, Mao took a trip to Moscow to meet with Joseph Stalin for the first time in history. Both leaders shared the same belief that unity would be vital and agreed to sign a bilateral treaty called the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. This included a military alliance that required one to come to the other's aid if they were attacked by outside forces. However, more important to China were the economic benefits of the treaty, including a $300 million loan, as well as the provision of Soviet technical advisors. During the 1950s, thousands of industry experts, scientists, and technicians from the Soviet Union lived and worked in China. The leadership and advice played a very important role during the major industrialization years of China. Whilst using the advice of Soviet economic strategists, Beijing finally committed itself to Stalinist models of development, growth, and agricultural collectivization. The collaboration between the two was successful, however. There were clear signs of strain. When Mao visited Russia in 1949, he managed to negotiate a successful treaty, but privately he felt undervalued and disrespected. Mao believed that Stalin had somewhat undervalued the unity that was spoken of during the trip, and looked at Mao as an underling and not an important partner. During the mid-1950s, Mao committed his forces to the Korean War, in belief that Stalin would follow his decision and commit Soviet forces, provide men, machinery, and weapons. However, Stalin was hesitant about being drawn into an open conflict with the United States, and instead confined Soviet involvement in Korea to air support, as well as supplying aircraft, weapons, and munitions. Stalin also made sure to charge Mao's government full price for this assistance. The Korean War was politically a success for the Chinese. However, at the time, the costs of such a war to an already struggling economy were felt harshly. After the war, Mao felt somewhat exploited and betrayed by Soviet leader Stalin, who he felt had failed to honor their agreed-upon treaty. In 1953, Stalin passed away. Mao now began to imagine himself as the world's senior communist leader. Following Stalin's death, Leadership of the Soviet Union was passed on to Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev was a party official who had previously shown devout loyalty to Stalin. However, in February 1956, Khrushchev delivered a famous speech named Secret Speech, in which he condemned Stalin for his personality cult, despotism, show trials, purges, and violence during his reign of power. After Khrushchev's criticisms of Stalin, Mao was left in an awkward position. Mao, who somewhat distrusted Stalin in private, had always presented Stalin publicly as a brilliant socialist leader, had also replicated Stalin's cult of personality within his own country, China. Khrushchev's secret speech was somewhat of a betrayal to Stalin's legacy in Mao's eyes, and China responded to this by developing their own interpretation of Stalin, which was articulated in the People's Daily on April 5, 1956. Some people consider that Stalin was wrong in everything. This is a grave misconception. Stalin was a great Marxist-Leninist, yet at the same time a Marxist-Leninist who committed several gross errors without realizing that they were errors. We should view Stalin from a historical standpoint, make a proper and all-round analysis to see where he was right and where he was wrong, and draw useful lessons therefrom. Both the things he did right and the things he did wrong were phenomena of the international communist movement and bore the imprint of the times. Taken as a whole, the international communist movement is only a little over 100 years old, and it is only 39 years since the victory of the October Revolution. Great achievements have been made, but there are still shortcomings and mistakes. As tensions slowly began to rise, the following years show where their relationship started to break down. In October 1957, the Soviet Union and China agreed to sign a new defense accord. Moscow agreed to share new military technologies with China, most importantly including nuclear weapon prototypes. Relations between the two started to deteriorate shortly after. A major part of this was the outcome of Khrushchev wanting a softer line towards the West. Mao was strongly against this, as he had always attacked and shunned the US for being what he called imperialist bullies that are to be feared and resisted. But Khrushchev continued to suggest that peaceful coexistence with the US was possible. In 1958, Khrushchev visited China, but the meeting did not go well at all. Khrushchev and fellow members of the Soviet Union were housed in dilapidated apartments without air conditioning, despite the sweltering heat. During talks between Mao and Khrushchev, Mao seemed to have treated Khrushchev with arrogance and disdain, not far off of how Mao had previously felt treated by Stalin in '49. Mao rejected and refused to even consider Khrushchev's proposition in a joint defense project. Khrushchev strongly retaliated to this by pulling the majority of Soviet advisors out of China shortly after. The following year, Khrushchev would return to China to deliver a speech that infuriated Mao, praising the US President, Dwight Eisenhower, and his foreign policy. The trip Khrushchev had planned was supposed to be for 7 days. However, after such an acrimonious speech was cut down to just 3. Moscow began to reject terms of the 1949 military alliance, and within a year, the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance was all dead. In 1960, the Soviet Union pulled its remaining technical advisors out of China, which left several major infrastructure projects unfinished. The following years did not get any brighter for the two. Verbal clashes between Russian and Chinese delegates at party conferences happened through the years of 1960 and 61. In 1962, following the Cuban Missile Crisis, Mao accused Khrushchev of being afraid of the US. In 1962, when China and India briefly went to war over border disputes, Moscow dumped its support behind India. By this time, China and the Soviet Union were engaged in a Cold War of their own. However, relations still continued to worsen. In 1964, Mao Zedong claimed that the Soviet Union still held Chinese territory that was stolen by pre-revolutionary Russia. July 1964, he withdrew China's ambassador and cut off diplomatic ties with Moscow completely. Anti-Soviet propaganda inside of China was heavily pushed towards the Chinese people. In August 1967, at the peak of the Cultural Revolution, around 200,000 Red Guards, whipped into a frenzy by Mao's anti-Soviet rhetoric, began to siege the Soviet embassy in Beijing. With relations in ruins and the once strong connection between the Soviets and the Chinese torn apart, the two powers clashed with a brief border war in the late 1960s. Disagreements happened over a contested border in Xinjiang province of northwestern China, lead to several Sino-Soviet talks. However, these quickly broke down. During the summer and autumn of 1968, both sides, the Chinese and the Soviets, had increased their military presence in the region. Eventually, more than 1.5 million soldiers were accommodated on both sides of the Ussuri River, which separated Russia and China. In 1968, the Chinese defense minister, Lin Biao, claimed that his Chinese forces were preparing for an invasion of Soviet territory. The first skirmishes started in March 1969, which consisted of Chinese and Russian soldiers firing at each other on Zhenbao Island. More and more clashes followed, which forced the resumption of talks to happen in June. It is reported that between 350 and 700 soldiers were killed in the sporadic fighting in Xinjiang, most of them being Chinese. During the time of the fights, Soviet commanders even considered using tactical nuclear weapons against its former ally. In September of 1969, Vietnamese communist leader Ho Chi Minh died, which facilitated the restoration of diplomatic contact between Moscow and Beijing. However, Sino-Soviet relations remained frosty.